The first time Margaret Holloway saw the man she had agreed to marry. He was standing at the edge of a frozen field in northern Alberta, with a dead coyote slung over one shoulder and blood on his gloves, and her first thought was not, "I have made a mistake." It was something quieter and more final than that. It was, "Who did I think I was writing to?" I have told this story to a handful of people over the years, and every time I tell it I am asked the same question. Did she stay? And every time I smile before I answer, because the question assumes that staying was ever the hard part. Staying was the easy part. The hard part was what she had to give up to do it. Not comfort, not Boston, not her sister's house or her career teaching secondary school in Halifax. What Margaret Holloway had to give up was the version of herself that believed she could read a person correctly in the first 5 minutes of knowing them. She was, by her own reckoning, quite good at people. That winter in Alberta taught her how wrong she was. Margaret Holloway was 34 years old when she answered the advertisement. She was a history teacher at a girls' school in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and she had been described in various ways and by various people she respected as precise, demanding, and not easy to be around. She did not consider any of those descriptions an insult. She had been engaged once at 28, to a man who taught mathematics and shared her interest in reading and her distaste for social performance. They had been well suited on paper. In person, over time, she discovered that his idea of a partnership was one in which she agreed with him thoughtfully. The engagement ended in the spring. By 34 she had stopped expecting anything different. The advertisement she found was tucked into the back pages of a farm publication she had borrowed from a colleague for an article she was researching on prairie grain economies. She almost did not read it. She was not the kind of woman who read matrimonial advertisements, or so she told herself, but the advertisement was unusual enough that she stopped. Alberta cattle rancher, 41, seeks a woman capable of genuine conversation, not looking for easy, looking for honest. Right if you mean it. That was the whole of it. No list of requirements, no mention of cooking or children or disposition. She sat with it for 2 days before she wrote back. She told him she was a history teacher, that she had strong opinions and a poor tolerance for people who said what they thought you wanted to hear, and that she was not sure what she was looking for, but that his advertisement had been the first honest thing she had read in a farm publication in 6 months. She did not think he would write back. He wrote back in 11 days. His name was Thomas Wren. His handwriting was slow and deliberate, the kind that comes from someone who did not grow up writing easily, but had taught himself to be careful about it. He asked her what period of history she found most instructive and why. Not what she taught. What she found most instructive. She wrote 3 pages in response. He wrote back in 9 days with 2 pages of disagreement, a brief acknowledgement that she had made one point he could not refute, and a question about the Northwest resistance of 1885 that no one had ever thought to ask her before. Over 14 letters and 4 months, Margaret Holloway fell into something she had not planned for. Not love, not exactly. Respect first. Then curiosity. Then a kind of recognition, the feeling of encountering a mind that worked differently from yours but was not threatened by yours. He had sent her a photograph at her request, taken in town the previous spring. Clean-shaven, hat in hand, squinting slightly into the light. A solid-looking man, serious with a direct gaze that matched his letters. She boarded the train in Halifax in November, carrying 2 trunks and a certainty she had spent 4 months building. The man at the edge of the frozen field was not the man in the photograph. He had a beard that had grown without any particular intention of being groomed. He was wearing a canvas coat with a tear along the left sleeve that had been mended, badly, with what appeared to be baling twine. He was holding a coyote by its hind legs, and the blood on his gloves had frozen slightly in the cold. He looked at her across the yard with the same directness as the photograph and said, "You must be Margaret." Train was on time then. Then he turned and walked toward the barn to hang the coyote. She stood in the yard with her 2 trunks, and the absolute certainty that she had made a catastrophic error in judgment, and she began composing in her head the letters she would write to her sister, explaining that she would be returning to Halifax before the first real snowfall. The housekeeper, a compact Cree woman named Agnes, who had worked for Thomas for 11 years and had the manner of someone who had seen everything twice, came out from the house, took one look at Margaret's face, and said, "Come inside, there's tea. He's always like that when he's been dealing with predators." Then she picked up one of the trunks herself and walked back toward the house without waiting to see if Margaret would follow. Margaret followed. She was not sure what else to do. The house surprised her. She had expected something sparse and functional. Thomas Wren was not a man who decorated, but the walls held bookshelves that ran floor to ceiling on 2 sides of the main room, and the books were not for show. They were read, reread, annotated in pencil, marked with slips of paper. She recognized Parkman's Histories, a collection of geological surveys, the complete reports of the Geological Survey of Canada bound in faded green cloth. There was a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius next to a seed catalogue. A copy of Thoreau had been left open, face down beside the wood stove. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at those shelves for a long moment. Then she sat down at the table and drank her tea and said nothing. Thomas came in an hour later, having washed the blood off his gloves. He sat across from her without ceremony and said, "You're disappointed." "I'm surprised," she said. "That's the same thing usually." He was right. She did not tell him that. He showed her to her room, which was small and clean, with a good lamp and a window that looked out toward the stand of spruce that marked the north edge of the property. He said, "The door latches from the inside. We're married on paper, and that's something we can decide how to feel about as we go. I'm not in any hurry." He said it plainly, without any particular feeling one way or the other, and then he said goodnight and went back downstairs. Margaret latched the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and tried to reconcile the man who had written those 14 letters with the man who had walked away from her carrying a dead coyote without a word of greeting. She could not do it. Not yet. The first week was polite and careful and deeply uncomfortable. Thomas was not a man who filled silence with noise. He spoke when he had something to say and did not speak when he did not. This was not a quality Margaret had encountered often in the men she knew, and she was not sure whether she found it restful or unsettling. Probably, she thought, both. She had expected, in the way she had always feared, that marriage would immediately begin to reduce her, that he would have opinions about how she spent her time, what she did with her days, whether her way of doing things fit properly into the shape of his life. She braced for it the way she had always braced for it, with a cold and practiced readiness. It did not come. When she said she wanted to understand the operation of the ranch, the finances, the grazing rotation, the relationship between the cattle markets and the weather patterns, Thomas sat down with her and explained it. All of it, not a simplified version, not the versions you give someone you expect to get bored and go away. The actual numbers, the actual problems, the actual decisions he was wrestling with. When she asked questions, he answered them. When she pointed out something he had not considered, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's right. I hadn't looked at it that way." He did not say it as though it cost him something. In the second week, she asked Agnes how long Thomas had been alone on the ranch. Agnes said 11 years, since his wife had died of a fever when their daughter was 3. The daughter Clara, now 14, was at school in Edmonton and would be home for Christmas. Margaret had not known about Clara. It had not come up in the letters, and she understood after a moment's thought that Thomas Wren was not a man who introduced the people he loved into correspondence with someone he had not yet decided to trust. She found she did not mind that he had waited. She was beginning to understand that his caution was not coldness. It was the way a man moves when he has learned that certain things break and cannot be put back together. The third week, she asked him directly why he had advertised. He was fixing a section of fence at the time, working methodically in the way he did everything, and he did not stop what he was doing while he considered the question. Finally he said, "Clara needs someone who knows something. Not a housekeeper, someone who can teach her how to think. I can teach her the land, I can't teach her everything." And the conversation? Margaret said, "That was in the advertisement too." He looked at her for a moment. "Alberta winters are long," he said. "I got tired of talking to the cattle." It was, she thought, the closest Thomas Wren came to a joke. She was not sure if he knew it was funny. She suspected he did. She wrote to her sister that evening and did not mention returning to Halifax. December came with a cold that was different from anything she had known in Nova Scotia. It was not wetter or more bitter. It was just simply more serious. The cold in Halifax made you uncomfortable. The cold on the Alberta prairie made you understand that you were not the most important thing in the landscape. Margaret respected this. She had always preferred honesty to comfort, and there was something almost honest about a cold that did not pretend to be anything other than dangerous. She learned to dress for it. Agnes taught her without being asked, appearing one morning with a pair of wool-lined boots and a sheepskin vest, and showing her how to layer them correctly without explaining why. Because Agnes was sensible enough to know that some lessons are more useful delivered without preamble. Clara came home for Christmas on the 23rd of December. She was 14 and had her father's directness and her mother's dark eyes, and she stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at Margaret with the careful assessment of a person who has been disappointed before and has decided to be fair about it anyway. She said, "You're the one from Halifax." "I am," Margaret said. "Papa says you teach history." "I do. Do you think the Métis were treated fairly during the resistance?" Margaret looked at her. "No," she said. "I think the Canadian government made decisions that served the government and called them decisions that served the country, which is a different thing entirely." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been arguing about that with my teacher for a month. She says the government acted in the interest of national unity. National unity is sometimes used as a reason for a great many things that don't hold up well under examination," Margaret said. Clara smiled, small and quick, the same smile as her father. She picked up her bag and went upstairs, and Margaret stood in the kitchen and understood that she had just passed a test she had not been told she was taking. That night at dinner, for the first time, the table was not quiet. January was when everything changed. Margaret had been writing since October, learning from Thomas in the same unhurried way he taught. everything, showing her what to do, letting her do it, correcting the specific thing that needed correcting rather than everything at once. By January she was competent enough to ride the fence line alone, which she preferred. She liked the silence of it, the way the land opened up under the winter sky, the feeling of being responsible for a task and completing it without assistance. It was the 14th of January when she crossed the creek on the east boundary. She knew there was a creek. She had crossed it before. What she did not know, and what Thomas had not told her because it had not occurred to him that she would go out after the previous night's temperature drop, was that this particular section of the creek had an underground spring that kept it from freezing solidly even in deep cold. The ice looked the same as the ice anywhere else it was not. Her horse went through to the shoulder. She went into the water. The cold hit her like something solid. She got her feet under her and got herself out of the creek. She was not graceful about it, but she was fast, which mattered more. And she stood on the bank in the January air soaking wet with the temperature somewhere around -28 and understood, with the historian's instinct for assessing situations clearly and without sentiment, that she was in serious trouble. Her horse had bolted east. The ranch house was 4 miles west. She was wearing good layers but they were wet, and wet layers in -28 do not keep you warm for long. She began walking and ran the numbers as she walked. A person in her condition in this temperature, in wet clothing, had roughly 40 minutes before the cold started making decisions on her behalf. She was 4 miles from the house. She could not walk 4 miles in 40 minutes in these conditions. The arithmetic was not in her favor. She had been a history teacher for 11 years. She had studied disaster, war, the particular way that good people found themselves in untenable situations through a sequence of individually reasonable decisions. She had always thought she understood those stories intellectually. Standing in the snow on the east fence line of a cattle ranch in northern Alberta, she began to understand them in a different way entirely. She walked for 2 miles. Then her legs stopped working the way she was asking them to work, and she sat down in the snow to think about it. And some part of her that was still clear, understood that sitting down in the snow was not a thought. It was a symptom. And that this was how the story ended for people who did not have someone coming. Thomas Wren found her 20 minutes later. He had been in the barn when her horse came back without her. He said afterward, with his characteristic absence of drama, that he had simply gotten on his own horse and gone to find her, that there was no particular decision involved. It was the obvious thing to do. He had ridden the fence line at speed in the dark and the cold, calling her name at intervals, and when he found her sitting in the snow he did not say anything for a moment. He got off his horse and pulled her to her feet and lifted her onto the saddle in front of him and wrapped his coat, the canvas coat with the torn sleeve mended in baling twine, the coat she had judged before she had spoken 10 words to him, around her from behind and rode back to the ranch house at a careful, steady pace, holding her against him with one arm. She was shaking by the time they got inside. Agnes appeared without being summoned, which Margaret suspected was simply Agnes understanding how the world worked, and positioning herself accordingly. Together they got Margaret out of the wet clothes and wrapped in blankets and settled close to the wood stove. And Thomas sat behind her on the floor with his back against the wall, and held her against his chest, because that is what you do for someone whose body temperature has dropped. And he knew what you do, because Thomas Wren had spent 40 years in a place where knowing what you do in an emergency was not academic. She shook for almost an hour. He held her the whole time and did not speak, not because he had nothing to say but because he understood that this was not a moment for words. When the shaking finally slowed she said, "You came out in that cold to find me." He said, "Of course," she said. "I thought, the coyote, the coat. I judged you in 5 minutes. I had already decided who you were before you'd said a word to me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know, I could see it on your face. You knew and you didn't say anything. No, why not?" He thought about it. Outside the wind had come up, moving through the spruce trees on the north edge of the property with a sound like water. Finally he said, "Because it wouldn't have meant anything if I'd told you. It only means something when a person figures it out themselves. You're a smart woman, Margaret. I trusted you to get there," she said. "That's a generous amount of patience. The ranch teaches you patience," he said. "Or it teaches you to sell the ranch." She laughed then and it surprised both of them. He did not laugh but something in his face shifted and she understood that for Thomas Wren that shift was the equivalent. She said, "I was going to write to my sister, in the first week. I was planning how to explain that I was coming home." He said, "I know that too. I stayed because of the books." "I know that too," he said. "I was glad you noticed them." Clara appeared in the doorway, took in the situation with the complete composure of a 14-year-old who had grown up on a cattle ranch and considered emergencies a normal feature of life, and said, "I'm making soup. Does anyone object?" No one objected. Margaret Holloway and Thomas Wren were formally married in the spring, in the small United Church in town, with Agnes and Clara as witnesses and a minister who had known Thomas for 15 years and told Margaret afterward privately that he was glad Thomas had finally found someone who was willing to argue with him about things, because he himself had been doing it for a decade and it was good to share the work. Margaret wrote to the girls' school in Halifax and did not return. She taught Clara and, in time, the children of 3 neighboring families, operating a kind of informal school out of the ranch house for 6 years until the consolidated school opened in town. She updated Thomas's accounting records, which were accurate but poorly organized, filed in a system that made sense only to Thomas, and turned them into something that gave them a clear picture of where they were losing money and where they had room to grow. Thomas looked at the new records for a long time and then said, "This is better than what I had." He said it with the same directness with which he said everything, and Margaret understood by then that this was his highest form of compliment. They argued about everything: the appropriate role of the federal government in prairie agriculture, whether Wilfrid Laurier had made the right decisions about the West, the best way to manage a north-facing pasture in a dry year, the proper temperature at which to serve tea. Clara, who grew up watching them argue at the dinner table, told her own children later that she had never seen her father happier than when he was losing a debate to Margaret on a point he had been certain about. Thomas Wren died in 1924 at the age of 63. Of a heart that had simply worked as hard as it could for as long as it could. He died on the property he had built, in the house that now held more books than when Margaret had arrived because she had kept adding to the shelves and he had never once told her to stop. Margaret lived until 1938. She was 78. After Thomas died, Margaret kept the coat, the canvas coat with the torn sleeve, the one he had wrapped around her on the night. She sat down in the snow and almost did not get back up. She never had the sleeve repaired. When Clara asked about it, years later, Margaret said, "Because I judged your father by that coat before I had any right to an opinion. And then that coat came back to the east fence line with him inside it and brought me home." She folded her hands on the table in the way she had when she was making a point she wanted to land. "The least I can do is let it keep the tear." Clara Wren became a teacher, like Margaret, and then a school principal, and then a school inspector for the province of Alberta. She told the story of her father and Margaret to her own students once, at the end of term, when she felt they needed it. She told them what Margaret had told her, more than once, in the kitchen of the ranch house when the homework was done and the tea was poured. "You will meet people who look wrong to you at first. The coat will be wrong, or the boots, or the job, or the answer they give to the first question. And you will feel very certain, because you are intelligent and you pay attention, and you will be wrong anyway. The people worth knowing are the ones who give you the winter to find out." I have thought about Margaret Holloway's winter in Alberta for a long time, about the particular courage it takes not to run from a first impression, but to stay with it long enough to find out whether you were right. It is easier than it sounds to leave. It takes something harder to remain, in the cold and the uncertainty, and allow yourself to be proven wrong about a person. I wonder sometimes, and I wonder this now for those of you listening, if there is someone in your life you judged in the 5 minutes and decided, you already knew: a coat with a tear in the sleeve, a rough first word at a train station, or a cold yard, or an unexpected silence. Someone who has given you the winter in their patient and unhurried way and is still there. Tell me. I'd like to know if I'm not the only one asking.